November 6, 1895, Fifth Avenue, New York City. 300 policemen struggle to hold back the crowd outside St. Thomas Church. Thousands have gathered since dawn, pressing against the barricades, craning for a glimpse of the bride. Inside, 400 of America's wealthiest citizens wait in the pews. At the altar stands a British duke. He arrived late. Last-minute negotiations over the settlement had delayed him. The bride is 20 minutes behind schedule. When her carriage finally arrives, those close enough to see notice something unusual. Behind her veil, the 18-year-old heiress appears to have been crying. Her face is swollen, her eyes are red. She walks down the aisle anyway. Consuelo Vanderbilt, granddaughter of the richest man in America, is about to become the Duchess of Marlborough. Her dowry, $2.5 million in railroad stock, will save a crumbling English palace. Her happiness is not part of the transaction. This was not a tragedy. This was a business model. Between 1870 and 1914, more than 450 American heiresses crossed the Atlantic to marry European aristocrats. They traded fortunes for titles, dollars for dukes. Their collective dowries exceeded what would today amount to billions. British newspapers called it an American invasion. American newspapers called it selling daughters to the highest bidder. History would call them the dollar princesses. This is the story of how desperate British nobles and ambitious American mothers created the most expensive marriage market the world has ever seen, and the young women who paid the price. Chapter 1. The Marriage Market. To understand why British aristocrats were suddenly willing to marry American girls they considered socially inferior, one must first understand what happened to their income. For centuries, English nobility had derived their means from land. They owned vast estates, collected rents from tenant farmers, and lived off agricultural profits that seemed as permanent as the soil itself. In 1815, Parliament protected this arrangement with the Corn Laws, tariffs that kept cheap foreign grain out of British markets and prices high for domestic producers. Then, in 1846, Parliament repealed those protections. Immediate effects were modest. British agriculture continued to prosper through the 1850s and 60s, and landlords saw little reason for concern. But the repeal had set something in motion that would take 3 decades to fully materialize. By the 1870s, American farmers had opened up the vast prairies of the Midwest. Steam-powered ships could now transport grain across the Atlantic, faster and cheaper than ever before. Suddenly, wheat from Kansas cost less in London than wheat grown 50 miles away in Kent. What followed was swift and merciless. Wheat prices fell by half between 1870 and 1894. Land values plummeted. Tenant farmers went bankrupt and stopped paying rent. By 1885, Britain had lost over 1 million acres of wheat-growing land. Aristocratic families watched their revenue evaporate, while the costs of maintaining enormous estates remained brutally fixed. Oscar Wilde captured the predicament perfectly in his 1895 play, The Importance of Being Earnest. When Lady Bracknell interrogates a potential suitor about his income, she asks whether it comes from land or investments. "Investments," he replies. "That is satisfactory," she declares. "Land has ceased to be either a profit or a pleasure. It gives one position and prevents one from keeping it up." Audiences laughed because they recognized the truth. Between 1809 and 1879, 88% of British millionaires had been landowners. By 1914, that figure had collapsed to 33%. Old fortunes were dying, and the great houses were dying with them. Yet selling the estates was unthinkable. These were not merely homes. They were physical embodiments of family legacy, passed down through primogeniture for generations. A duke who sold his ancestral seat was a duke who had failed his bloodline. Working for income was equally impossible. Rigid social codes of Victorian England prohibited aristocrats from engaging in trade or commerce. A gentleman might invest, but he could not be seen to earn. The very activities that might have saved them were beneath their station. This left precisely one option: marriage. A bride with a substantial dowry could inject desperately needed capital without the taint of commerce. Her resources would restore the roof, rehire the servants, and keep the estate intact for the next generation. All that was required was finding a woman rich enough to afford the price of admission. Here lay the problem. Affluent English families were suffering the same agricultural crisis. Their daughters came with diminished settlements, or none at all. Traditional marriage markets had dried up. But across the Atlantic, a new kind of prosperity was multiplying at an almost incomprehensible rate. American industrialists, men who built railroads, refined oil, mined coal, and manufactured steel, had accumulated assets that dwarfed anything English aristocracy had ever possessed. The Vanderbilts alone controlled more capital than the combined treasuries of several European nations. These men had means. What they lacked was social standing. In New York, old Knickerbocker families looked down on the newly rich as vulgar upstarts. Mrs. Astor's famous ballroom held precisely 400 guests, the supposed limit of respectable New York society, and many industrial families could not buy their way inside. Daughters of railroad barons and mining magnates found themselves excluded from the social recognition their father's success should have commanded. A title offered a solution. No amount of Astor snobbery could diminish a duchess. A woman who married into British peerage acquired a status that American society had to acknowledge. She would be presented at the court of St. James, received by royalty, and addressed by a title that predated the American Republic itself. The transaction practically arranged itself. British nobles had titles but no capital. American industrialists had capital but no titles. Their children could solve both problems simultaneously. By the 1880s, this exchange had become so common that publications emerged to facilitate it. A directory called Titled Americans listed not only American women who had already married into European aristocracy, but also, helpfully, unmarried British peers still available, along with estimates of their debts and the conditions of their estates. It was, in effect, a shopping catalogue for daughters. Matchmaking mothers on both sides of the Atlantic studied these listings carefully. Professional intermediaries emerged society women who, for a fee, would arrange introductions between cash-rich American families and title-rich British ones. Debutante seasons in London became hunting grounds where American girls, chaperoned by ambitious mothers, were paraded before eligible earls and viscounts. Numbers tell the story of how thoroughly this market functioned. According to the 1915 edition of Titled Americans, 454 American heiresses had married into European nobility since 1870. 102 of those marriages were to British aristocrats. 6 were to dukes, the highest rank below royalty. The Library of Congress later calculated that American brides had married into more than a third of the House of Lords. Contemporary estimates suggested that at least $50 million, several billion in today's currency, flowed from American bank accounts into British estates during this period. Some historians place the true figure considerably higher. British aristocracy was being rescued, one American heiress at a time. But these transactions were not equal partnerships. Under British law, a husband assumed complete control over his wife's property and assets upon marriage. Legal frameworks that protected women's holdings in America did not apply once they crossed the Atlantic. An American heiress who married a British peer surrendered her dowry entirely. She also surrendered her home, her family, her country, and very often her happiness. Great houses she was paying to save were frequently cold, uncomfortable, and shockingly primitive by American standards. Central heating was rare, indoor plumbing was rarer. One duchess reportedly discovered that bathing required a housemaid to make 5 trips from the basement kitchen, carrying jugs of hot water up multiple flights of stairs. Many of these brides were teenagers, married off before they had any real understanding of what they were agreeing to. Their opinions were seldom consulted. Their consent was often coerced. Mothers who arranged these matches told themselves they were securing their daughters' futures. Fathers who paid the dowries told themselves they were purchasing social elevation. Grooms who accepted the settlements told themselves they were preserving their heritage. No one asked the brides what they were telling themselves. In 1874, the first of these transformative marriages took place. A beautiful young woman from Brooklyn, daughter of a Wall Street speculator, married the son of a duke after knowing him for only 3 days. Her name was Jenny Jerome. Her son would one day save Britain from Nazi Germany, and she would show every ambitious American mother exactly how the game was played. Chapter 2. The Pioneer, Jenny Jerome. Leonard. Jerome made and lost fortunes the way other men changed shirts. A Wall Street speculator with a talent for risk, he earned the nickname King of Wall Street during his most successful runs, and watched millions evaporate during his worst. He owned racehorses, founded racetracks, and kept a mansion on Madison Square that featured something no other private home in New York possessed: a theater seating 600 guests. He also kept mistresses, several of them. This was the scandal that would ultimately change British history. In 1867, Leonard's wife, Clara, had endured enough. She packed up their 3 daughters, Clara, Jenny, and Leonie, and sailed for Paris, placing an ocean between herself and her husband's infidelities. The girls would be raised as European ladies, educated in French language and culture, far from the gossip of New York society. Jenny was 13 years old. Paris transformed her. She studied piano under Stephen Heller, a friend of Chopin. Heller believed she possessed genuine concert-level talent, if she was willing to work for it. She absorbed French, literature, and art. By the time she reached her late teens, Jenny Jerome had become something American, finishing schools rarely produced. A young woman who was not merely accomplished, but genuinely interesting. She was also strikingly attractive. One admirer, Lord d'Abernon, would later write that there was more of the panther than of the woman in her look. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, with an intensity that unsettled as much as it charmed, Jenny possessed a quality that set her apart from the demure debutantes of English drawing rooms. She reportedly had a small snake tattooed on her wrist. Scandalous for a woman of her class, thrilling to the men who noticed it. In August of 1873, the Jerome family attended a sailing regatta on the Isle of Wight. A ball followed the regatta. There, 19-year-old Jenny was introduced to Lord Randolph Churchill, the 24-year-old third son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough. What happened next would become legend. Within 3 days of meeting, they were engaged. Lord Randolph wrote to his father announcing his intention to marry the American girl immediately. His parents were appalled. The Churchills were an ancient family, their title dating back to the early 18th century, their seat at Blenheim Palace, one of the grandest homes in England. That their son would marry anyone after a 3-day acquaintance was alarming. That he would marry an American, the daughter of a stock speculator no less, was unacceptable. They demanded the engagement be broken off. Lord Randolph refused, Jenny refused, and Leonard Jerome, never one to back down from a negotiation, began discussing terms. What followed was 8 months of transatlantic correspondence as lawyers for both families haggled over the marriage settlement. The Churchills considered Leonard's initial offer insulting. Leonard considered their expectations extortionate. Letters flew between New York, Paris, and London, each side testing the other's resolve. The Duke of Marlborough made clear that his son had significant debts. Leonard made clear that his daughter was not a blank cheque. Round after round of proposals and counter-proposals followed. Finally, in the spring of 1874, both sides reached an agreement. Leonard would provide £50,000, approximately $250,000, as a marriage settlement. Crucially, he insisted that £1,000 per year be paid directly to Jenny, not her husband. It was an unusual provision, one that gave his daughter a degree of financial independence rare for a bride entering British aristocracy. The Duke, for his part, agreed to increase Randolph's annual allowance and settle his existing debts. Neither family was entirely satisfied. Both recognized the marriage would proceed regardless. On April 15, 1874, Jenny Jerome married Lord Randolph Churchill in a small ceremony at the British Embassy in Paris. She was 20 years old. She had known her husband for less than a year and spent most of that time separated from him by an ocean. 7 months later, on November 30th, Jenny gave birth to a son at Blenheim Palace. The baby arrived, according to the family, 2 months premature, the result of a fall Jenny had suffered while out with a shooting party. Skeptics noted that the infant seemed remarkably healthy for a child born so early. They named him Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. Whatever the circumstances of his conception, Winston would grow up to reshape the 20th century, and much of what made him capable of doing so came directly from his mother. Jenny proved a revelation in English society. Where British women of her class were expected to be ornamental and silent, she was opinionated and engaged. Where they deferred to their husbands in all matters political, she became Lord Randolph's most effective campaign strategist. During his rise through conservative politics in the 1880s, Jenny wrote speeches, cultivated allies, and worked rooms with a skill that seasoned politicians envied. Some historians credit her with being the de facto campaign manager behind her husband's ascent to Chancellor of the Exchequer. Her social success was equally remarkable. Despite initial suspicion of her American origins, Jenny charmed her way into the highest circles of Victorian society. She became a close friend of the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, and was rumoured to have been considerably more than a friend for a time. When the prince was coronated in 1902, Jenny was one of only 3 former mistresses invited to attend the ceremony at Westminster Abbey. But her marriage to Randolph deteriorated as his health declined. By the late 1880s, he had begun showing signs of a debilitating illness, possibly syphilis, possibly a brain tumour. The diagnosis remains disputed. His behaviour became erratic, his moods violent, his political judgment increasingly poor. In 1886, he resigned from the cabinet in a fit of pique, expecting to be begged to return. No one begged. His career was finished. He died on January 24th, 1895, at the age of 45. Jenny was a widow at 41. She did not remain one for long. In 1900, Jenny married George Cornwallis West, an officer in the Scots Guards. He was 26 years old, the same age as her son Winston. Society was scandalized. Jenny was indifferent. The marriage lasted until 1914, when George left her for the actress Mrs. Patrick Campbell. 4 years later, at 64, Jenny married again. Her third husband, Montague Porch, was a civil servant 3 years younger than Winston. When asked about the age difference, Porch reportedly replied that he had a fondness for older women. They remained married until her death. Between husbands, Jenny kept busy. She founded and edited a literary quarterly called the Anglo-Saxon Review. She wrote plays. One of them, despite starring the great Mrs. Patrick Campbell, flopped badly. During the Boer War, she raised funds to equip a hospital ship, the Maine, and personally supervised its operations in South Africa. She also championed her sons' careers with ferocious determination. Winston, in particular, benefited from her connections, her advice, and her relentless advocacy. Their correspondence reveals a relationship of unusual intimacy and mutual dependence. She pushing him forward, he seeking her approval, both bound by an understanding that they were playing a larger game. In May of 1921, Jenny fell down a staircase and broke her ankle. Gangrene set in. Doctors amputated her left leg below the knee. 2 weeks later, on June 29th, she hemorrhaged and died. Winston, by then a rising political figure, was devastated but philosophical. "I do not feel a sense of tragedy," he wrote, "but only loss. Her life was a full one. The wind was in her veins." Jenny Jerome had arrived in England as an outsider, an American interloper whose family had traded dollars for a place at the table. She left it as the mother of a future prime minister, a woman who had bent aristocratic society to accommodate her rather than the other way around. She had shown what was possible. Other American mothers took notes, none more carefully than Alva Vanderbilt. Chapter 3. The Monster Mother. Alva Erskine Smith was born with ambition she could not afford. Her family in Mobile, Alabama, possessed what Southern society valued most: respectable lineage and proper manners, but lacked what increasingly mattered in post-Civil War America: hard currency. The Smiths had pretensions. They did not have means. Alva grew up understanding that the distance between those two conditions could only be bridged by a strategic marriage. She made hers in 1875, wedding William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the legendary Commodore. William was handsome, agreeable, and possessed a share of the largest fortune in America. Alva was 22, fiercely intelligent, and burning with plans her husband could finance. Within a decade, she had transformed herself from a penniless Southern girl into the most powerful hostess in New York. Her weapon was architecture. In 1882, Alva completed construction of a limestone palace at 665th Avenue, a French Renaissance chateau dropped onto Manhattan's most prestigious street. Nothing like it existed in America. The building announced, in 3 stories of carved stone and soaring turrets, that the Vanderbilts had arrived. But New York society, guarded by the fearsome Caroline Astor, refused to acknowledge them. The exclusive circle that Caroline Astor guarded so jealously remained closed to many industrial families, including the Vanderbilts. Old Knickerbocker families considered railroad money vulgar. The nouveau riche were not welcome. Alva declared war. In March of 1883, she announced a costume ball to celebrate her new mansion. Invitations went out to everyone who mattered, except Mrs. Astor. The city buzzed with anticipation. Costumes were commissioned from Paris. Newspapers devoted pages to speculation about who would wear what. Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie, had been rehearsing a special quadrille with her friends for weeks, expecting to perform it at the ball. But no invitation arrived. Carrie was devastated. Her mother was cornered. To secure her daughter's place at the most talked-about event of the season, Caroline Astor did what she had sworn never to do. She sent her calling card to Alva Vanderbilt. In the rigid etiquette of Gilded Age society, This gesture constituted formal recognition. The Vanderbilts were now officially acceptable. Alva had won. She would spend the rest of her life winning, but victory over Mrs. Astor was merely a prelude. Alva had larger plans, plans that centered on her only daughter, born in 1877 and named Consuelo after Alva's closest friend. From the moment Consuelo could walk, Alva began preparing her for a destiny greater than mere New York society. The girl would marry European royalty. She would become a duchess, perhaps even a princess. She would achieve what no Vanderbilt, no American, had achieved before: genuine aristocratic standing in the old world. This ambition justified any method. Consuelo's childhood was a curriculum of control. She was educated entirely at home, surrounded by governesses and tutors who answered to Alva. By 8 years old, she could read and write in English, French, and German. Every Saturday, she was required to recite poetry in all 3 languages, while her mother listened and judged. There was no swimming, no tennis, no golf. The only pleasure Consuelo remembered from her youth was a weekly dancing class conducted by Mr. Dodsworth, an elderly instructor who had taught generations of New York children. Even this modest recreation served Alva's purpose. A future duchess must know how to waltz. Physical perfection was as important as intellectual accomplishment. Alva was obsessed with posture. A lady held herself erect. A duchess held herself like a queen. To ensure Consuelo met this standard, Alva commissioned a device. It was a steel rod that ran the length of the girl's spine. Leather straps fastened it at the waist and over the shoulders, forcing Consuelo's back into rigid alignment. She wore this contraption during her lessons, hour after hour, the metal pressing into her back while she tried to write, to read, to simply exist without pain. The rod made writing nearly impossible. Holding a book required raising it to eye level. Sitting was an exercise in endurance. Consuelo wore this device throughout her adolescence, her body trained into an elegant shape through sustained discomfort. When she failed to meet her mother's expectations, when her posture slipped, when her recitation faltered, when she expressed an opinion of her own, Alva reached for the riding crop. She whipped her daughter for minor infractions. The punishments were not rare. They were routine. Years later, Consuelo would recall the moment she understood her place in Alva's universe. As a teenager, she had objected to clothing her mother had selected. She thought, perhaps, that she might have some say in how she presented herself to the world. Alva's response was immediate. "I do the thinking. You do as you are told." 7 words that defined a childhood. 7 words that would echo through a disastrous marriage. By her late teens, Consuelo had grown into precisely what Alva had designed: tall, slender, elegant, fluent in multiple languages, and completely subjugated. She was also, by all accounts, genuinely beautiful, with dark eyes, a long, graceful neck, and a presence that turned heads wherever she appeared. She attracted suitors. Alva received at least 5 proposals of marriage on her daughter's behalf, including one from a Battenberg prince. She rejected them all. None were grand enough. Then Consuelo did something unforgivable. She fell in love. His name was Winthrop Rutherford. He came from impeccable American stock, descended from the original Knickerbocker families that had once looked down on the Vanderbilts. He was tall, athletic, and widely considered the handsomest bachelor in New York society. He was also, at 33, 15 years older than Consuelo. None of this mattered to Alva. Rutherford had no title. He was merely rich and merely American. He was unacceptable. The couple became secretly engaged anyway. When Alva discovered the relationship, she responded with overwhelming force. She forbade Consuelo from seeing Rutherford. She intercepted the girl's mail. She posted servants to watch her daughter's movements. When Rutherford attempted to visit, he was turned away at the door. Consuelo was a prisoner in her own home. Desperate, she planned to elope. Rutherford would meet her, and they would flee before Alva could stop them. It was the only act of rebellion Consuelo had ever attempted. Alva discovered the plan. She locked her daughter in her bedroom. Through the door, she delivered her ultimatum. If Consuelo attempted to see Rutherford again, Alva would have him killed. Whether she meant it literally remains unknown. Consuelo believed her, but Alva had more weapons than threats of violence. She understood her daughter's psychology, the guilt, the need for approval, the years of conditioning that had taught Consuelo to yield. And so Alva deployed her most devastating tactic. She collapsed. Claiming that Consuelo's disobedience was destroying her health, Alva took to her bed. She stopped eating. She wept. She informed Consuelo that continuing this romance would kill her mother. Day after day, Consuelo watched Alva waste away. Day after day, she was told that only her submission could save her mother's life. Finally, broken, she agreed to give up Winthrop Rutherford. Alva made a miraculous recovery. The performance had worked. Now Alva could deliver her daughter to the destination she had always intended: marriage to British aristocracy. She had already identified the groom. Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, was 24 years old, physically unprepossessing, and universally disliked. Contemporaries described him as surly, critical, suspicious, and devoid of intellectual qualities. His nickname was Sonny, ironic, given his temperament. What he possessed was Blenheim Palace, one of England's greatest houses, and a title that would make Consuelo a duchess. What he lacked was the money to maintain either. Alva arranged an invitation to Blenheim during a family trip to England. She maneuvered her daughter into the Duke's presence at every opportunity. When they returned to America, she continued the campaign, inviting him to visit Marble House, the Vanderbilt summer cottage in Newport. In the Gothic room of that palazzo, surrounded by medieval tracery and pointed arches, the Duke of Marlborough proposed to Consuelo Vanderbilt. She accepted because she had no choice. The engagement was announced, the wedding was scheduled, the contracts were drawn. Alva had done what she set out to do. Her daughter would become a duchess. What Consuelo would become was someone else's tragedy. Chapter 4. The Weeping Bride. On the morning of November 6, 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt woke to her wedding day and spent it weeping alone. No one came near her. Alva had posted a footman outside her bedroom door with orders to admit no one. Not her governess, not her maids, not a single person who might offer comfort or counsel. Consuelo dressed in solitude, putting on the elaborate lingerie with its real lace trim, the white silk stockings, the satin shoes. She did so, as she later wrote, like an automaton, a machine going through motions it had been programmed to perform. The gown waited for her. Cream-coloured satin with a 5-foot train trimmed in heirloom lace, the sleeves puffed in the fashionable leg of mutton style. On her head, she would wear a wreath of orange blossoms, the symbol of purity that Queen Victoria had made popular when she married Prince Albert half a century earlier. Her bouquet was an enormous arrangement of orchids shipped across the Atlantic from the greenhouses of Blenheim Palace. Even the flowers came from the groom's estate, a reminder that she was being delivered to a destination, not choosing one. She felt cold. She felt numb. and she could not stop crying. Meanwhile, at the church, chaos reigned outside and tension mounted within. Thousands of spectators had gathered since dawn, pressing against police barricades, desperate for a glimpse of the bride. The nave was filled with the cream of New York society, though notably, most of the Vanderbilt family had declined to attend. The groom's side was thin. The bride's side was complicated by her parents' recent divorce. The whole affair carried an air of transaction rather than celebration. The Duke of Marlborough was late. He had spent the morning in meetings with lawyers, engaged in last-minute negotiations over the settlement. Even now, with guests seated and the organist cycling through his repertoire for the third time, Charles Spencer Churchill was haggling over the terms of his compensation. The final price had been agreed months ago, but the Duke wanted assurances. He wanted guarantees. He wanted every penny he had been promised, documented and secured before he spoke his vows. Consuelo was also late, though for different reasons. When she finally emerged from her family home to enter the carriage with her father, it was obvious to everyone that she had been crying. Her face was blotched and strained beneath the veil. William Kissam Vanderbilt, who had lost so many battles with his former wife, sat beside his daughter in silence. There was nothing he could say. He was about to give her away to a man she did not love, in a ceremony orchestrated by a woman he had divorced. The ride to the church must have been interminable. The guests waited. 20 minutes passed. Murmurs rippled through the pews. Had something gone wrong? Had the bride changed her mind? She had not changed her mind. She had simply been unable to stop crying long enough to leave on schedule. When Consuelo finally appeared at the church entrance, the congregation rose. 8 bridesmaids in matching gowns preceded her down the aisle. Her father took her arm. The organ swelled, and Consuelo Vanderbilt began the longest walk of her life. She moved toward the altar where the Duke stood waiting, his expression unreadable. Whatever romantic fantasies young brides might harbor about their wedding day, the joy, the anticipation, the sense of beginning something wonderful, Consuelo felt none of them. She felt only the weight of her gown, the pressure of her father's arm, and the hot tears sliding down her face behind the inadequate shield of her veil. The ceremony proceeded. Vows were exchanged. The words that would bind them together for the next quarter-century were spoken in the episcopal ritual, and Consuelo Vanderbilt became Her Grace, the Duchess of Marlborough. Then came the part the guests did not see. Immediately after the ceremony, while the congregation waited and the organist played a triumphant recessional, the wedding party retired to the vestry. There, in that small room behind the altar, surrounded by vestments and prayer books, the business was concluded. The marriage contract was produced. Signatures were required. This was not a formality. The Duke of Marlborough had insisted that the financial settlement be legally executed at the earliest possible moment. That meant minutes after the vows had been spoken, before the bride and groom had even emerged as man and wife. The documents specified the transfer of railroad stock, the guaranteed annual income, the various provisions and covenants that would bind the Vanderbilt fortune to the Spencer Churchill estate. Consuelo signed. The Duke signed. The lawyers witnessed. Now they could face the public. The reception was held at Olver's townhouse on 72nd Street. 115 guests attended the wedding breakfast, a phrase that did little to describe the elaborate luncheon that followed. Champagne flowed. Toasts were offered. The newspapers, which had been fed details for months by Alva herself, reported breathlessly on every aspect of the affair. From the bride's gown to the gold fastenings on her undergarments, a detail Alva had leaked to generate excitement. The headlines the next morning captured the public's fascination. "She is now a duchess," proclaimed one paper. Thousands of women besiege the young woman's home and St. Thomas's Church, announced another. A satirical cartoon depicted Consuelo kneeling at the altar in her wedding gown, her hands shackled behind her back, chained to her mother. The cartoonist understood what the breathless society pages obscured. This had been a sale, not a wedding, and the cruelest moment was yet to come. After the reception, after the farewells, after the crowds had dispersed and the newspapers had gone to print, the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough departed for their honeymoon. They sailed for Europe, first to Paris, then to England, and eventually to Blenheim Palace itself. During those first weeks of marriage, the Duke educated his new wife. He drilled her on the Spencer-Churchill family tree, the complex hierarchies of British aristocracy, the protocols and precedents she would need to master. He took her to the House of Worth in Paris and dressed her like a doll in gowns appropriate for a duchess. He replenished the family jewels with Vanderbilt money, purchasing pearls that had once belonged to Catherine the Great and the Empress Eugenie. And somewhere during that honeymoon, in a moment Consuelo would never forget, the Duke of Marlborough told his bride the truth. He informed her that he had given up the woman he actually loved in order to marry her. He made clear that he harbored no romantic feelings for his new wife and had no intention of developing any. He had married her, he explained, because it was the only way to save Blenheim. The ancestral palace was everything to him. Consuelo was merely the means of preserving it. This confession was not delivered in anger or cruelty. It was stated as simple fact, the terms of their arrangement laid bare now that the transaction was complete. The Duke, it seemed, felt no need to pretend. He had purchased what he needed with his title. She had paid for it with her freedom. The exchange was finished. Now they would live with the consequences. For Consuelo, who had surrendered the man she loved and endured years of her mother's dominion, all to stand beside a man she did not choose, the honeymoon revelation was devastating. She was 19 years old. She was a duchess, and she was utterly alone. The glitter, as she would later title her memoir, had revealed itself to be merely glitter. Beneath it lay only cold stone. Chapter 5. Saving Blenheim. The palace that awaited Consuelo Vanderbilt was not the magnificent seat of English aristocracy she might have imagined. It was a depleted husk. Blenheim had been built between 1705 and 1722 as a gift from Queen Anne to the first Duke of Marlborough, a reward for his military victories over the French. The architect, John Vanbrugh, had designed it to rival Versailles itself, a statement in stone that Britain's greatest general deserved a palace to match any king's. For 2 centuries, the Spencer-Churchills had occupied this monument to national gratitude. But monuments require maintenance, and the Marlboroughs had long since exhausted the money to provide it. By the time Consuelo arrived in 1895, generations of financial mismanagement had stripped Blenheim of much of its contents. The 5th Duke had been a notorious spendthrift. The 7th Duke had been forced to sell paintings, furniture, and even the famous Sunderland Library. 18,000 rare volumes auctioned off to pay debts. The 8th Duke, the current Duke's father, had died, leaving the estate virtually bankrupt. What remained was architecture. 300 rooms, acres of lead roofing, miles of corridors, and an endless appetite for repairs that no one could afford. The structure itself had begun to decay. Grandeur was still visible, but it was the grandeur of a ruin. This was what Consuelo's dowry had been purchased to save. Restoration began immediately. Even during their honeymoon, the Duke had been replenishing the family's depleted possessions. The jewels from Paris were only the beginning. Tapestries, paintings, and furniture were acquired across Europe and shipped back to Oxfordshire. Servant numbers expanded dramatically. 40 for the interior of the house, another 50 for the grounds. Blenheim would once again operate as a great estate, with a staff appropriate to its scale. The Duke threw himself into the work with an intensity that seemingly surprised those who knew his languid temperament. He hired the French landscape architect Achille Duquesne to create elaborate water gardens on the terraces. He redecorated the state rooms on the western side of the palace with gilded panelling in imitation of Versailles. An irony, perhaps, given that Vanbrugh had designed Blenheim specifically to outshine Louis XIV's creation. The interiors became pastiches of French royal taste, beautiful but derivative. The Duke would later regret some of these choices, but no one could deny that he had saved the building itself. The human cost of this salvation fell primarily on Consuelo. Shortly after her arrival in England, she was summoned to meet her husband's grandmother, Frances, the Dowager Duchess. The old woman wasted no time on pleasantries. "Your first duty," she informed Consuelo, "is to have a child, and it must be a son. It would be intolerable to have that little upstart Winston become Duke." The little upstart in question was Winston Churchill, son of Lord Randolph and Jenny Jerome, born in this very palace 21 years earlier. As the Duke's closest male relative, Winston stood next in line to inherit if Consuelo failed to produce a male heir. The Dowager Duchess considered this prospect unacceptable. Consuelo understood the assignment. In September of 1897, she gave birth to a son, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, who would carry the courtesy title Marquis of Blandford. The following year, she delivered another boy, Ivor Charles. She had provided, as she would later phrase it with bitter precision, the heir and the spare. The succession was secured. Winston Churchill would have to find something else to do with his life. With her dynastic obligations fulfilled, Consuelo might have retreated into the decorative role expected of a duchess, hosting parties, wearing the right gowns, appearing at the right occasions. Instead, she found purpose in a direction no one had anticipated. She discovered the tenants. Blenheim's estate encompassed thousands of acres and hundreds of families who worked the land or served the household. These people lived in conditions that reportedly shocked Consuelo's American sensibilities. Cottages were poorly ventilated. Sanitation was primitive. Children worked rather than attended school. Medical care was scarce. The Duchess, who had grown up in Fifth Avenue mansions, now walked muddy lanes to visit families who had never seen the inside of the palace they labored to support. She brought food. She brought medicine. She brought attention to problems that had been invisible to generations of Marlboroughs. The tenants, who had expected nothing from another foreign duchess, found themselves with an advocate. They adored her for it. Her charitable work expanded beyond the estate. Consuelo became involved in causes affecting mothers and children throughout Britain. She supported movements for improved sanitation, better education, and workers' rights. Her politics, by aristocratic standards, were dangerously progressive. She endorsed free school meals, healthcare for children, and old-age pensions. She would later become an active supporter of women's suffrage, following, in this, as in so much else, the path her mother had blazed. In society, too, Consuelo exceeded expectations. The English had anticipated another gauche American, all money and no manners. What they encountered was a woman of extraordinary beauty, genuine intelligence, and impeccable grace. She charmed the Prince of Wales and became a fixture in the Marlborough House set. She attended Queen Victoria's funeral. She served as canopy bearer to Queen Alexandra at Edward VII's coronation. She travelled to the court of Tsar Nicholas II. The playwright James Barrie, author of Peter Pan, spoke for many when he said he would stand all day in the street just to watch her get into her carriage. Yet none of this brought her closer to her husband. The Duke had his own preoccupations, his clubs, his sports, his endless focus on restoring Blenheim. Travel became Consuelo's escape. Paris was her favourite refuge, where she could sometimes enjoy the company of her exuberant father. At home, she found solace in an unexpected friendship. Winston Churchill, the young man who might have been Duke, was a frequent presence at Blenheim during these years. Consuelo found him captivating. He was the life and soul of the young and brilliant circle that gathered about him, she later wrote. His conversation was invariably stimulating. She contrasted him pointedly with her husband, noting that Winston's views were not drawn and quartered, as were Marlborough's, by a sense of self-importance. Their friendship would endure for decades, long after her marriage ended. In 1905, the family sat for John Singer Sargent. The resulting portrait, which still hangs in Blenheim's Red Drawing Room, captures the Marlboroughs at the height of their public success. The Duke in his robes, Consuelo resplendent in white satin, their two young sons positioned between them. It is a magnificent image of aristocratic splendour. It is also a portrait of a marriage already dying. By the time Sargent finished his work, the Duke and Duchess had essentially ceased to function as a couple. They maintained separate lives within the vast house, their encounters governed by protocol rather than affection. The nervous tension between two incompatible people, forced to coexist in proximity, had reached what Consuelo called its highest pitch. In 1906, after 11 years of marriage, they formally separated. Consuelo left Blenheim Palace and moved into Sunderland House, the London mansion on Curzon Street that her father had built for her. She would not return as a resident. The palace had been saved, the marriage had not. And Consuelo, at 29, found herself a duchess without a duke, a mother whose children would be raised primarily by their father, and a woman who had given her youth to a house that had never truly been her home. Vanderbilt money continued to flow. The settlement guaranteed it, and Blenheim continued to thrive on American dollars. The water gardens bloomed. The state rooms gleamed. Visitors came to marvel at the restoration. But Consuelo would write, years later, that during all her time there, she had felt like nothing more than a beautiful figurehead. Ornamental, expensive, and utterly without agency. The glittering cage had been gilded with her own inheritance. And now, finally, the door stood open. Chapter 6. The Confession. 15 years passed between separation and divorce. Consuelo remained the Duchess of Marlborough in name throughout those years, maintaining her London residence while the Duke occupied Blenheim. They attended the same social functions. They shared the same circles. Their sons moved between both households. But they lived as strangers who happened to share a marriage certificate. The Duke had found someone new. Gladys Deacon was another American, born in Paris to expatriate parents, and she had been fixated on Charles Spencer Churchill since the age of 14. When she first learned of his engagement to Consuelo Vanderbilt in 1895, the teenage Gladys had written to her mother expressing dismay that she was too young to catch him yet. She was not exaggerating her ambition. By the late 1890s, Gladys had maneuvered herself into the Marlboroughs' social orbit. She visited Blenheim as a guest. She befriended Consuelo. She dazzled London society with her striking beauty and sharp intellect. The affair between Gladys and the Duke began around 1906, the same year the Marlboroughs formally separated. For the next 15 years, Gladys served as his mistress, while Consuelo remained his wife. When the divorce was finally granted in 1921, both parties moved swiftly to remarry. The Duke married Gladys Deacon in Paris that same year. She was 40 years old, and she had achieved the ambition of a lifetime. But the victory proved hollow. Their marriage deteriorated into mutual hostility. By 1933, the Duke had evicted her from the palace. He died the following year. Consuelo's second marriage followed an entirely different trajectory. On the 4th of July, 1921, just weeks after her divorce was finalized, she married Lieutenant Colonel Jacques Balsan. He was a French aviator, a pioneer of balloon and aircraft flight who had once worked with the Wright brothers. He was also the heir to a textile manufacturing fortune. But most importantly, he was a man Consuelo had chosen for herself. The couple had known each other for nearly 3 decades. Balsan had first encountered Consuelo when she was 17, still trapped in her mother's household, and he had reportedly fallen in love with her immediately. Now, finally, they could begin the life that circumstance had denied them. They settled in France, dividing their time between Paris and a chateau near Dreux. Later, they built a home in Florida, near Palm Beach. Consuelo named it Casa Olva, in honor of her mother. That name tells us something important about what happened between these two women. Alva Vanderbilt had reinvented herself. After her second husband, Oliver Belmont, died in 1908, Alva channeled her formidable energy into a new cause. The woman who had manipulated New York society and orchestrated her daughter's disastrous marriage now turned her attention to women's suffrage. She joined the National American Woman Suffrage Association. She founded her own political equality association. She opened Marble House for suffrage conventions and fundraising events. By 1916, Alva had helped found the National Woman's Party alongside Alice Paul. She organized the first picketing ever conducted at the White House. She brought English suffragettes to America for speaking tours. She used her wealth and social connections to advance a cause that many considered dangerous. The woman who had denied her daughter any voice in her own future was now fighting for the right of all women to have a voice in their governance. Somewhere in these years, mother and daughter began to reconcile. The relationship that had been defined by control slowly transformed into something closer to mutual respect. By the early 1920s, they were close again. Then came the annulment. The Duke of Marlborough had converted to Roman Catholicism after his second marriage. But under canon law, his divorce from Consuelo presented a problem. The Catholic Church did not recognize civil divorce. In the eyes of Rome, he remained married to his first wife. There was only one solution. The first marriage would need to be annulled. Under Catholic canon law, coercion was grounds for declaring a marriage null and void from its beginning. The Duke approached Consuelo with the request, and she agreed to cooperate. The marriage had been a transaction from the start. Why not acknowledge that officially? But an annulment required testimony. It required someone to confirm that Consuelo Vanderbilt had been forced to marry against her will. And so, more than 30 years after the wedding, the woman responsible for that coercion finally confessed. In 1926, Alva Belmont appeared before an investigator working on behalf of the Vatican Tribunal. She was 73 years old. She had spent the past 2 decades fighting for women's autonomy. And now she was being asked to testify about the choice she had denied her own daughter. Alva did not equivocate. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke," she stated. "I have always had absolute power over my daughter." On the 19th of August, 1926, the Vatican declared the marriage null and void. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, it had never been a valid union at all. The newspapers seized on Alva's confession. Here was a leader of the suffrage movement, admitting she had forced her daughter into a loveless marriage for social advancement. The champion of women's rights had denied her own daughter the most fundamental right of all. But Consuelo did not condemn her mother publicly. The confession had been necessary to free them both. Alva died in Paris in 1933 at the age of 80. She left $100,000 to the National Woman's Party. The headquarters she had purchased for the organization still stands on Capitol Hill, now designated the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. Consuelo and Jacques remained happily married until his death in 1956. In 1953, she published her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold. She died in 1964, at the age of 87. Her burial instructions were specific. She wished to be interred at St. Martin's Church in Blenheim, the parish church for Blenheim Palace, beside the grave of her younger son, Lord Ivor. After everything that had happened, Consuelo chose to spend eternity within sight of the palace she had been purchased to preserve. Chapter 7. The Legacy. Consuelo Vanderbilt was not alone. Between 1870 and 1914, more than 100 British aristocrats married American women. 6 of them were dukes. By some estimates, American blood now ran through a significant portion of the British aristocracy. The phenomenon was so widespread that publications tracked these marriages and listed eligible bachelors, serving ambitious American mothers as a guide to the British peerage. Some of these unions ended in misery. Others produced unexpected triumphs. Mary Leiter was born in Chicago in 1870, the daughter of Levi Leiter, co-founder of the retail empire that would become Marshall Field and Company. Like Consuelo, she was groomed for greatness. Unlike Consuelo, she chose her own husband. When Mary met George Curzon at a London ball in 1890, she was 20 and he was 35, a Conservative member of Parliament with a brilliant future and a crumbling estate. Mary fell in love immediately. On the day they met, she wrote to a friend, stating that she would have him because she believed he needed her, adding that she had no shame about her determination. They married in Washington in 1895. The same year, Consuelo walked unwillingly down the aisle in New York. But where Consuelo's marriage was a transaction she never wanted, Mary's was a partnership she actively pursued. In 1898, George Curzon was appointed Viceroy of India. Mary became Vicereine, the highest political position ever attained by an American woman at that time. She was second only to the Queen in the hierarchy of the British Empire. At the Delhi Durbar of 1902, celebrating the coronation of Edward VII, Mary wore a gown embroidered with gold thread and peacock feathers, each eye set with a beetle wing that spectators mistook for emeralds. As she walked through the hall, the crowd was reportedly breathless. She championed medical care for Indian women, established scholarships for female doctors, and took an interest in Indian arts. She was genuinely beloved, but the climate and the demands of the position destroyed her health. Mary Curzon died in 1906 at the age of 36. The Lake Geneva princess had risen higher than any American woman before her, and it had cost her everything. Another American found a different kind of power entirely. Nancy Langhorne was born in Danville, Virginia, in 1879. By the time she reached adulthood, her father's railroad business had prospered, and she was sent to finishing school in New York. She married a wealthy Bostonian at 18. The marriage was miserable. They divorced in 1903. 2 years later, Nancy sailed for England. She met Waldorf Astor, son of Viscount Astor, and heir to a newspaper fortune at a house party. They married the following year. His father gave them Cliveden, one of the grandest estates in England, as a wedding gift. When Waldorf was elected to Parliament, Nancy supported his political career. Then, in 1919, his father died, and Waldorf inherited the Viscountcy. Under British law, he had to leave the House of Commons for the House of Lords. His constituency needed a new representative. Nancy decided to run. On December 1st, 1919, she became the first woman ever to take her seat in the British House of Commons. She held that seat for 26 years, championing temperance, education reform, and welfare for women and children. When Winston Churchill told her that having a woman in Parliament felt like having someone intrude on him in the bathroom, she reportedly replied that he was not handsome enough to have such fears. 2 American women. One became the most powerful woman in the British Empire. The other broke down the doors of its most exclusive political institution. Neither had arrived as a trembling bride purchased with her father's money. But the legacy of the dollar princesses extended further than anyone could have imagined. In 1880, a New York heiress named Frances Ellen Work married an Irishman named James Burke Roche, the son of a baron. Her father, a stockbroker who had made his fortune as a protégé of Cornelius Vanderbilt, threatened to disinherit her. She married Roche anyway. The marriage was unhappy. They separated. Frances returned to New York and sued for divorce. When her father died in 1911, he left an estate of $15 million. But James Burke Roche eventually inherited his brother's title and became the 3rd Baron Fermoy. His son, Edmund, became the 4th Baron. Edmund's daughter, Frances Ruth Roche, married John Spencer, the 8th Earl Spencer. And in 1961, Frances Ruth gave birth to a daughter named Diana. Princess Diana, the most famous woman of the late 20th century, carried American blood in her veins. Through that connection, Princes William and Harry and William's children are descendants of New York's Gilded Age. The future King of England traces part of his lineage to a Manhattan stockbroker's rebellious daughter. The dollar princesses also left their mark on popular culture. When Julian Fellowes created Downton Abbey, he drew directly on their stories. The character of Cora Crawley, the American heiress who marries the Earl of Grantham and saves his estate with her fortune, was modelled on women like Mary Leiter and Consuelo Vanderbilt. The show introduced a new generation to this world. The fascination endures because the stories combine love and money, power and powerlessness, in ways that feel both alien and familiar. Consuelo Vanderbilt lived to see some of these transformations. She watched women gain the vote. She watched the aristocratic world that had consumed her youth crumble under 2 world wars. She watched her mother become a champion of the freedoms she had once denied her daughter. In The Glitter and the Gold, Consuelo reflected on what her marriage had meant. She had been sold for a title, but she had also raised 2 sons, championed the poor, and eventually found love with a man of her own choosing. The last dollar princess died in 1964 at 87. She had been a Vanderbilt, a duchess, and finally Madame Bolsant. She chose to be buried in England, near the palace where she had spent her unhappiest years, beside the younger son she had outlived. The great estates the dollar princesses saved still stand, maintained by trusts and ticket sales. Tourists walk through Blenheim Palace and pose for photographs in front of the Sargent portrait. But their legacy lives on in unexpected places. In the blood of the British royal family, in the stories we tell about wealth and power, in every young woman who has ever been told that her value lies in what she can bring to a marriage rather than who she is. These American girls crossed an ocean to become duchesses. Some found misery, some found purpose, a few found love. All discovered that titles come with a cost. Consuelo Vanderbilt paid that cost in full, and then she built a life worth living from the wreckage. She was free.